Sugar Act is not enforced nearly as well as it should have been. The tax eventually is removed pretty much entirely after the Stamp Act crisis. So this is coming later, okay? But again, we want to ensure as much wealth as possible. The next way of ensuring that wealth is to restrict the colonists' access to wealth, to money itself, by preventing the colonists from being able to print money. So you can use gold and you can use silver, but that is all that you can utilize to pay debt. Now here's the problem, is there a lot of gold and silver in the colonies?
No.
No, and we haven't gotten to California or Colorado yet, so we have no idea that, hey, there actually is gold and silver in their hills, okay? But we have no idea about it at this point in time, so there's not a great access to gold and silver. Well, how do you pay your taxes if you don't have gold and silver? And that's the only thing that you are allowed to pay your taxes with.
You
You
don't. Smuggle it?
Don't, you smuggle it, or you try to print money to somehow pay other things. Does that make sense? So you can use what limited gold and silver that you have to actually pay the taxes, and then you use the paper currency for exchange of products between each other. But that's also illegal. And so in order to restrict that, the Crown puts in place the Currency Act, which says, hey, you cannot use anything but gold and silver, period, for anything. If you are going to buy something or sell something, it has to be bought and sold in gold and silver. And the colonial economy begins to collapse because you have to be able to utilize fluid wealth. It's one of the biggest reasons why the United States is no longer on the gold standard. Okay? Because it makes it much more difficult to create and generate wealth, but also it makes it more difficult to buy and sell stuff. Does that make sense? So what sets the value of our dollar today?
Like the overall economy.
Yeah, the government basically creates a value for it. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's not actually backed by anything.
It's really worthless.
Technically, but it's not. Because it has value.
We say it has value.
Because we say it has value.
But like back in the gold standard, it actually had value.
But back, it had legitimate weight value.
You could take
Does
it
that
to
make
the bank
sense?
and get your gold back.
Yes, you could have taken it to bank and gotten
So
gold.
a pound was like an actual.
Yeah, so in the 1920s, I just know these figures because of that time frame. It's a really big issue. Gold is a 4-to-1 ratio, and silver is a 16-to-1-ish ratio. Does that make sense? So for every 4 pounds of gold, it was equal to $1.
Wait, what?
Or 4 ounces, not 4 pounds.
Like
4 ounces, sorry.
Wait, 4 ounces?
4 ounces of gold equals $1.
Like 4 real ounces.
4 real ounces of gold equaled $1. And silver, because silver was much more plentiful, it was 16 ounces.
That's why
to
stuff
$1.
costs like a penny or like.
Yeah, okay? So, now that being said, that's part of the reason why we would go through an economic crisis through the teens and into the 20s. Does that make sense?
So like $1 would have been equivalent to like a few $1,000s now.
Yeah.
Oh my.
I mean, something like that, if you were to figure out and calculate the inflation rate of gold with the inflation rate of the dollar versus, does that make sense? Because you'd have to calculate more than just one
So like
inflation
penny
rate.
candy stores and like
Yeah.
nickel movies.
It'd be interesting anyways, okay?
Wish we still had that.
Now, although there's no restrictive policy and no change then that comes from that, like there's nothing in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights that talks about money or anything like per se in the Bill of Rights, but in the Constitution it directly says who has the right to print money and regulate money. Does that make sense? Okay? And it is the role of the federal government to deal with that. Does that make so they deal with that through the Constitution, not through an amendment. Pre-1765, the colonists are already having to deal with and provide housing for those 7,000 men here. but it's not officially okay for the crown to do this. And so the colonists are arguing, I don't have to let you in my home. But there's a dude standing there with a gun. I mean, you probably have your own gun too, though, for hunting purposes, so, you know, you just
Shut the door and then.
shut the door in their face or get in a duel, I don't know. But it's not legitimized by the crown, right? And so the crown believes that if they create the law, the colonists can do nothing but abide by the law. And if they don't abide by the law, then simply the crown can
Take care of it.
arrest them, take care of it, punish them, seize their home, whatever such the crown wants to do. Does that make sense? Okay? Because now it is in actual law, not just in practice. So in 1765, we see the passage of the Quartering Act. But not only did you have to provide them with your home, but you also had to pay for their bedding, you had to pay for their food, and in fact, if you were the lady of the house, you were responsible for caring for any of the soldiers who were residing within your home, which meant you cleaned up after them, you washed their clothes, you made their meals. Okay? You basically were at their bidding call to do just about anything that they wanted you to do. Everything that they would need, you had to provide. Okay. And as you can about imagine, the colonists don't take too kindly to this. Okay? Now, it goes from originally just saying that you have to provide these basic needs, a fort or something, right? You have to provide a thing, to saying you actually have to provide your own home. And if there's like a house that's available, the local tavern is now going to be where these people are stationed and where you provide for them. Which also means you're not just providing them with food, but you're also having to provide them with beverage. And maybe not a very good idea for a bunch of very unregulated British regulars getting drunk in the tavern on a regular day. And here the colonists are working while the regulars are getting drunk. So I hope you can see that this tension is building within the colonists, okay? This resentment is building within the colonists. And again, we see this come up in the Bill of Rights. It's an amendment to the Constitution, right? We cannot allow for quartering of troops, okay? Now, as bad as all of those things were, it could only get worse. The crown still has not generated nearly as much money as they would like to generate from all of this taxation and everything else like that. So the crown decides to put in place another tax. Now this tax is different than the Molasses Act or even the Sugar Act, because those only directly targeted a particular group of individuals, merchants. The Stamp Act will target every single person in the colonies. And what it did was it made so that you had to have a stamp on every piece of paper that was maneuvered through the colonies. You had to have it on playing cards. You had to pay the tax on all sorts of things. We'll pick up with that tomorrow.